Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Blackwood, and welcome back to the Ralston College podcast. Today we have the writer Gregg Hurwitz, a lecture that he gave here in Savannah to our students. It was more of a kind of back and forth conversation. Gregg is a person of immense range as a writer, and he was talking here about form, the form that writing can take. And Gregg himself is a master genre writer. He's written a couple of dozen very successful thriller novels, including the Orphan X series. He's written scholarship involving academic approaches to psychoanalytic analysis of Shakespeare. He's written several comics, including in the Batman series. He's written a number of screenplays, and in fact, also the opening to the 2022 World Cup. If that's not a wide range, then I don't know what is. And anyway, the point that I want to make is that Gregg's talk focused on the matter of form and how a form is at its best when you're doing in it what you can only do in that form. But he also made a much larger, in a sense, even more powerful and beautiful point, which is about human subjectivity, or about our own selves, which is that we are at our best when we are doing what is most us. And, you know, this to me is a very, as I say, very powerful and beautiful thing. What I want to conclude with is what I think is the fundamental reflection about storytelling as a human being, which is that there's nothing more important, you might say, to human beings than being able to tell their own stories truly. Stories which we hope are stories of revelation and redemption. Here's Gregg Hurwitz. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to have Mr. Gregg Hurwitz with us today. Gregg is a man of many accomplishments. He's also someone I've become fast friends with in the last couple of years, mostly through adventures of the Old Testament, I think we can say. You wouldn't call it the Old Testament, probably, but the Exodus adventures have been a big part of that. We've been privileged to be part of the conversation, sort of seminar on this wonderful work of literature and religious history, let's say. Not simply because of the benefit of a certain kind of, let's call it a rhetorical framing, but because I think that rhetorical framing, which is a kind of liturgy in itself, but also because it does frame how you might come to understand things, I am going to risk embarrassing Gregg by just rattling off a few of his many accomplishments, especially as a writer. We say bestseller, and then there's bestseller. He's an internationally best-selling author of now 23 thrillers, including...
It's quite a Freudian slip, Blackwood.
Including the Orphan X series. These have won many awards and been published, and I did double-check this, in 33 different languages. It's written screenplays and television scripts and sold spec scripts to many of the major studios, including Sweet Girl and the Book of Henry. He's written comics for AWA, DC, and Marvel. He's written poetry, political, and culture pieces for the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Bulwark, and many others. This was, I didn't think I'd heard this correctly when he told me this himself, but he, in fact, helped write the opening ceremony for the 2022 World Cup. He's taught fiction in the USC English department, guest lectured at UCLA, for Harvard, and many other places. He's currently working on, in various ways and through various projects, against polarization in politics and in culture. And he is also married to the magnificent Delina, who's sitting here at the edge of the room. I know that several of you, and probably all of you, I hope all of you by now, have had the chance to speak with and get to know both Gregg and Delina. It's an enormous pleasure to have such friends of the college and have them here at the college as really among our first people to sort of join in this over on Gordon Street. That is, I know, been a very happy thing for them. So the format today is really going to be very simple. I'm going to ask Gregg a few questions. He's not much of a conversationalist, so I'll probably struggle to keep him going. And when I run out, I'm going to open up to the rest, to all of you. We're going to give as much time as we can for that. because I know that there will be many really good and searching and serious questions from all of you. And that's really why he's here. He's made it really clear to me that he wants to be as helpful to all of you however he can be. So Gregg, thanks very much for making the time to be here today. To start with a little bit of biography, I know we have people who are in some scope, some place in their own journeys of sort of discovering what they are made and meant to do. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you became a writer.
So I cut across the current of the culture in my family quite a bit. I'm from a family of doctors and lawyers, and I'm the eldest Jewish son. So to not be a doctor that's not a path that's strewn with roses, let's just say. Fortunately, I have an older sister who became a clinical professor of pediatric gastroenterology, so she shouldered the burden for me. But from a very young age, the only thing I ever wanted to do is to write. I mean, I literally wrote, I've like mysteries I illustrated in crayon when I was in 5th grade. Willie, Julie, in the case of the buried treasure. You might be familiar with some of my early work. Nobody actually says anything. Everyone retorts and replies, and it was that Hardy Boy action language. And I was just bent towards it. I thought in stories. And I think that the biggest benefit I had in a certain regard from my family, with whom I have a lot of differences and interests, was the base settings were all flipped in the positive, right? We want you to be educated, healthy, successful, all those things. And so it gave me a lot of strength and a foundation to really break off and pursue a lot of things that didn't ostensibly make much sense. I started writing my first novel, I was 19. I had a dream. I dreamt of an underwater prison off the coast of San Francisco that one prisoner escaped and opened all the vents during his escape, so it flooded and trapped everybody level by level, all these other murderers and rapists and terrorists, to effect his escape. And I wrote that. I woke up and wrote it in a white heat, and that was the opening chapter of my first novel, The Tower, which I published at a pretty young age. I studied English and psychology as an undergraduate because I followed everything that was the most intense interest to me. So I was obsessed with Freud and Jung. And in hindsight, all these things make sense if you follow the thing that you love the most, because I'm sure all of you are thinking right now, right, you have all these passions that aren't exactly, right, JP Morgan's not going to be kicking down the door, right, to offer everybody here an entry-level position in advanced algorithmic data analysis for VC. The aim is the passion, right, the purity of the passion that drives you to something, and then at some point, vocation takes hold, right, or opportunities take hold in different ways. And it only makes sense, I think, in hindsight. So why did I study Freud? Well, Freud's case studies are like these perfect short stories, right? He's so readable. Why did I study Jung? He's terrible to read, really. I mean, reading Jung's like digging a hole with your face. I think that's why Joseph Campbell's so popular, because he just gave the cliff notes to Jung. But all that Jung wrote about and was obsessed with was narrative, right? Including at the end, the whole second half of his life, he was only writing about alchemy, which makes kind of no sort of sense. For you all, it probably makes more sense than it did to me first being drawn to him. But with alchemy and the transmutation of base matter into pure, obviously that's it's not only like a narrative of an archetypal narrative, right? The thing of greatest value that's to be discovered in the dirtiest place, right? That's the pot of gold that the dragon hides. It's always the jewel in the toad's head that you're seeking in alchemy, but it also is his embodiment or his description of the Freudian cathartic technique, right? The trauma you least want to admit within yourself, that you have to go and excavate out from the dirty sort of, shame-riddled corners of your soul. And so Jung, in hindsight, it's like, oh, of course, like Freud, Jung, English, that makes perfect sense. But I wasn't driving forward with a plan. And I think part of that is having an artistic temperament, which all of you who I've spoken to do have part of that, right? Have at least one foot in chaos as well as one foot in order. I was just pursuing what I loved, and I started writing my first book, and came time to graduate. I had 14 college roommates, a big block of guys that we moved together, and they all went off to law school and business school or iBanking and were making money. And I applied for a fellowship to get a master's in Shakespearean tragedy because I needed a practical degree to enter the job force in case my plans to be a novelist didn't pan out. And I sort of was furiously finishing this first novel, rewriting what was a pretty egregious bad rough draft of it. I was learning to write by writing the novel, right? There's no way to become a novelist. There's no way to learn how to write a novel aside from doing it and failing. It's like parenting or being in a relationship. It requires real world engagement. And I was so young and learning so quickly that literally the end of every chapter was better than the beginning for what I'd learned to write it. So I had to write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite furiously. And then I had an enormous stroke of luck and sold my first book, and kind of never had to have a real job. I was able to write full time. But the first thing that I did was I figured out, one of the things I said as my roommates were going off into more successful, certainly more lucrative ventures was, if somebody would have just showed up and offered me $2,000 a month for the rest of my life, and I could sign on the dotted line, and I knew I'd have a desk. You're talking about your seat that you sat in for so many years as you were envisioning Ralston. If I could have signed on that dotted line and known that I had a bed and a desk and I could just write and I could write for the rest of my life, I certainly would have signed and taken that deal. And so when I sold my first book, I thought, well, this is always what I dreamed of. So if I live basically on that budget, like how many months has this deal bought me? Right? I didn't want to go out and buy a nice car or do anything. It was just gas in the tank of more time to be able to do and figure out that craft. And I needed it. It took me 2.5 years to sell my second novel. So it was an easier first run than sophomore effort, as is often the case.
Let me ask you another simple, hard question. What is a story, fundamentally? I know we all know what it is. How do you think about what a story is? And then, of course, what makes a good story?
So I write thrillers, right? And one of the most or I write crime fiction quite often. I've written a lot of different forms of genre, but one of the questions I get asked a lot is like, well, why does a Shakespeare scholar write thrillers? And so the first thing I do is correct them and say, I'm a Shakespeare dilettante, not a scholar. But Shakespeare, having the tragic flaw embedded in character, which is something I'm sure you guys are exploring in some of your ancient languages, that's the basis for narrative, right? When terrible things happen to good people, that's not narrative, that's life, right? That's pancreatic cancer, or that's the proverbial Acme safe that falls in your head, right, in a Warner Brothers cartoon. And so what has to happen is that your internal, whatever happens that's an internal conflict of the character has to open the door to the narrative. There's a mirror between the internal life and the internal character and the circumstances that are elicited forth in the narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be equivalent. Like quite often, a tiny moral misstep can open the door to way bigger moral consequences. But the mirroring of something that is inherent within yourself, that is a flaw, that opens the circumstances into the world, is the basis of what constitutes narrative. And we can talk about that in terms of archetypal narrative, where it's quite overt, right, in a hero's journey, which every culture in the world, you can find a tribe in the dead Amazon that's cut off from contact with every other form of humanity or any other cultures. We know a few things. They're going to have eyelids, they're going to have opposable thumbs, and they're going to have a hero story. So that's the part of me that I think is deeply Jungian, which is a belief that the drive within us to create narrative that is structured in a particular way is actually an evolutionary necessity. It's something that is selected to have us contend with the internal and external unknown, right? Or else you have to go out and die 5,000 ways, like, Tom Cruise in The Edge of Tomorrow, right? You just have to keep reliving Groundhog's Day. We don't have the room to have all those experiments. So the books and the narrative are our ability to be able to engage in different types of adventures and contend with the unknown in different circumstances vicariously. And so I'd say the combination of those two things, an exploration of the unknown, right? And very much of that is about opening up doors within ourselves as artists that we don't necessarily want to open up. And the more of those doors that we open up, the more we can write about shame or grief or vulnerability. Or more importantly, the more we can intimate them. Because what we want to do as a writer, what I want to do isn't to spell out a set of circumstances that are very specific. What I want to do is to create the conditions by which the reader will reinvent and recapture them in their mind. So to give you an example, I wrote a story one time. I wrote a book called You're Next, and I have two characters in it. And one is a kind of skeevy little guy, and the other guy's a big, brutish man, and they're key antagonists. And I set a challenge for myself that the big antagonist was only going to say one word in every scene in which he appears, but it would be the creepiest word possible. And so I set the scene where there's a home invasion, and they have a couple bound on a couch, and they're about to commence to elicit the answers and information that they want from them. And the big guy has a duffel on his shoulder, and the younger guy says to him, he's looking at these two bound and terrified couple. He says, "Where do you want to start?" And the big guy dips his shoulder, and the duffel bag falls to the floor with a clank of sharp metallic tools. And he says, "Joints." And I ended the chapter there. So not 3 months later, I'm out on book tour, and this woman comes up to me after I gave a talk, and she said, "Look, I loved your book. I just couldn't believe the superfluous violence. It was horrifying for me, like to read everything that you had and the way that you described it." And I just smiled. I said, "That was all you." I ended the chapter after that description. I didn't paint anything that was torture. I didn't paint anything that was violent, because if I intimate that, what she will elicit within herself is going to be her most horrifying version of that. And she'd actually conflated that with the fact that I'd written it. So the relationship between a novelist and a reader is very intimate. It's very different than if I write a screenplay or a TV show or comic. Everyone can have a different reaction to it, but we all see the same movie. But a novel exists in collaboration. If I sell 1 million copies of a book, there's 1 million different narratives that play in all of your heads. And so the aim of writing isn't to overspell the violence, the hope. It's to intimate, to indicate, to move you, to frame and set the parameters, the scaffolding around a story that it comes to life, that you fill all those things with your emotions. And that's that dance between trying to show, not overtly tell too much, and to leave holes. I'll give one quick example and there's devices to do this. There's horror, there's ways to elicit this emotional state, but I'll give one that's kind of equivalently or is illuminating of this. How many of you have seen The Sixth Sense? Okay. There's a boy in it. He sees dead people. That's the fundamental plot. You can't tell really, is it real? Is he psychotic? You don't know what's happening. It's a big Bruce Willis thriller written, directed by Night Shyamalan. And all we know of this boy is that he's seeing dead people everywhere. It's a horror movie. And we can't tell if he's ill or if it's in the real world. And his mom is played by Toni Collette, who's a fantastic actress. And her one thing she's a struggling single mom, and Bruce Willis is a psychologist who's brought in to interview this boy. And the one thing we know about her is that her sacred sort of love in her life was her mother, who passed away. She loved her mother. And she's struggling as a single mom, and she's exhausted with this kid who's seeing dead people. And there's a scene that happens where they're sitting in a car together, and traffic is stopped up, and we see it's kind of a jump scare that a guy with a bike helmet, his cranium's all smashed in, appears at the window. And the young boy, whose name is Cole, sees this dead person. And that's the cause of the traffic stop. Someone was hit and killed on a bike. And he says that to her, and she starts to kind of come apart. Like, you're seeing things again, it's so upsetting. And he says to her, "I saw Grandma." And Toni Collette, at this point in the film, she just breaks down crying. She's like, "Just don't. Like, all the craziness, all the mental health, all the everything, just don't talk about my mom. That's the one place I don't want your mental health or your illness to go." And she says that you visit her grave every week, and she says that you ask her a question, and she wants you to know that the answer is yes. And he pauses, he says, "What was the question?" And she starts sobbing, and she says, "I asked her if she's proud of me." It's this very moving moment. So now imagine if we reverse the information, right? So we're sitting in a car, and Cole says, "I want you to know I see Grandma sometimes. She says you go to her grave every week and ask if she's proud of you, and she wants you to know the answer is yes." There's no emotional reaction to that. It's just a flat piece of dialogue like any other. So in the reversal of the answer and the question, by literally making us reconstruct it, it's a moment in the film that you feel up your spine, because the order of information that's going in is leaving a lot for us to kind of reconstruct in the viewing of the movie. And horror works that way in ways which we can get technical about later. But so the constructing of a story it's a dance and a kind of collaboration quite often between, and that's an example of where you can do it in film, but between novelist and reader. And every book read every time is an original recreation of the story.
Gosh, thanks so much, Greg. I want to follow up with the whole notion of a story and the relation between the story and the self. You said a minute ago that there are things that make sense in retrospect, and this year our curricular trajectory has been to trace the development of the concept of the self in, broadly speaking, Western civilization. And we started with Homer, and we moved through Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Boethius and Dante and so on into the moderns. And where are we now? What did we do? We're at Locke. Okay, so there's this long arc, and many of these books, and of course we selected these books because they do this, but they have not only a conception of the self, but they have a self, the conception of which unfolds as you read the text and you think more deeply about it, but also in this kind of wonderfully mysterious way you find your own self kind of activated and coming to be self-reflective and come to sort of, ideally, one say, to a certain kind of deepening self-consciousness in that very, very reading about the structures of the self. And so what I want to ask is, how you talked about seeing things in retrospect, and I know, you and Delina well enough to know that, like most people, you've lived big and complicated and wonderful lives, and with all kinds of unexpected and unplanned, twists and turns in the road. And what I want to ask is, when we're coming to understand ourselves, we're not simply creating a story like, oh, I'm just going to make a kind of fiction about myself. That's not a very good way to live. It leads to kind of all kinds of untruth and falsity and discrepancy between what you think of yourself and what you really are. The ideal, in a sense, is to come to tell not just a better, but a truer, come to have a truer understanding or story of yourself, or a ever deepeningly more true understanding of yourself. It's not even static, like, oh, well, now I understand myself, and that's kind of it for now. I'll move on to the next thing. It's like, and so my question is, what have you found? How have you found? What are the practices, the modes of thought, the books, the ideals, the experiences, adventures, whatever, that have helped you come to better understanding of yourself through time?
So I'm going to take a funnel introduction to this. So I do a lot of firsthand research for the thrillers. I've gone up and stunt airplanes. I've snuck onto demolition ranges with Navy SEALs to blow up cars. I've gone undercover into mind control cults, right? And before I started my new series, I shot all the weapons that he's on, and I trained in mixed martial arts fighting. Not well. I mean, it was mostly a process of continuously reintroducing my face to the training mat, but I needed to do it. And part of what happened is, like, for all of us who have ever been hit in the face, whether by a fist or a ball or a elbow, there's a particular quality to face pain. You get hit in the face, it feels different than elsewhere. So getting choked out on a mat, if I'm fighting someone with mixed martial arts, there's a horrible claustrophobic element to that, which some of you who play in martial arts know that feeling. And part of me doing that, part of me going to do all these things firsthand, to experience them and research, is because I can't give a reader a front row seat to the action if I haven't experienced it. What I'll write instead then is something that's sort of a conglomeration of everything that everybody else has read and seen, right? And that's where you get all that shitty writing, like, and then everything went black when someone passes out. And it's like, no, I want that verisimilitude. I want the ring of that. And so being a writer is very much being open to opportunity. Another very quick story. I wrote a book, a thriller that took place in a hospital, and I wanted to interview one of the hospital techs, and the only time I could talk to him was while he was literally parting out a cadaver with a Sawzall to send the different parts to different departments. So the heads go to neurology and the elbows go to the orthopods. And so I'm sitting there interviewing him, wishing I'd worn galoshes. And he finishes the interview and he walks across, there's these two giant steel doors, right? He opens them up and inside are 24 corpses suspended from scissor figure 8 clamps, pinching the ears, and the bodies, their feet are swinging like this above the ground. Now they're stored that way because if you store bodies flat, they distort, and that makes them less useful to medical students during anatomy. So he grabbed one by the arm and slid it across the ceiling on a meat hook and lowered it back down. And of course, I thought this was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I had a scene in the book where my protagonist is kind of being pursued through the hospital after hours and he needed somewhere to hide. And what more perfect setting is there going to be? But had I not gone there being willing and to be open to opportunity, I wouldn't have discovered that. Had I viewed research as something where like, oh, I'm filling in the blanks of a story that's fixed, right? It's an ossified structure, not a living and breathing entity, and you're there to fill it in. So the same thing's true. If I know everything that I'm going to figure out through the course of a book, then it doesn't become narrative, to your point of what's a story. It's propaganda. It's Ayn Rand, right? And so the same thing holds true emotionally as well, right? So a lot of times, I was younger in my career, I wrote, I mentioned my kind of, mediocre first novel, which is called The Tower, where I had kind of heroes and villains. And I move increasingly to antagonists and protagonists. Like the best thing I can have in an antagonist is somebody who is whispering in the ear of the reader a worldview that is unbelievably tempting to embody, right? And if my protagonist can navigate that much complexity and maybe win in a 60-40, 51-49 sense, more power accrues to that protagonist for coming through that sort of gauntlet or that trial or that trip through hell that's filled with the complexities. Well, the same thing really holds true emotionally or psychologically. So if you're writing and you want to write something that's unique and that is distinctive, think about what's going on in the back of your head when you're having an argument with someone you're intimate with and you're really angry with them, right? And what are the ways that resentment unspoken that you might cloak your need to preserve ego or your need to be right, that you might cloak in a false virtue, right? And if you can start to dig in and notice those patterns within yourself, it makes for unbelievably compelling writing with characters. Because you don't just want them flawed, right? A character who does something that and then regrets it and knows it's a part of themselves that they're fighting with, but they still screwed up and got it wrong. That's how we relate to people, not if someone's just like smashingly perfect in every regard. And so a lot of the work as you deal with suffering and with difficulty, right? And especially there's sometimes one of the earliest premonitions I had coming from a background that was more secular of a belief in God were some of the early trials in my life that seemed so uniquely designed to torture me specifically, right? Like these are all my worst fear. Like this is my worst insecurities. These are my worst aspects of things that I'd have to contend with. And it's like, well, of course, right? The world gives you tools or circumstances that if you confront with them honestly, right, those circumstances are something that you sharpen yourself against to get an edge big enough to cut yourself open and spread it out and look at what lies gleaming before you, right? And so the engagement with those things in writing, that process of trying to open up to what's really happening, to go slow enough to really observe, right? What's a passive aggressive dig, right? What's a way to take power? What are ways that you might be cloaking vanity in other ways? And if you observe all those things that are in play around you all the time, right, then you have all these tools to be able to live and encounter them firsthand. And it's no different than going up, shooting a Benelli assault shotgun with a crew of Navy SEALs teaching me how to shoot. It's a practice within yourself. And if you can get to a place that you're sort of aligned and you understand a character, then their engagements become authentic, right? Then things become real. Then they're with a character who they're engaging with in a way that's a dynamic, right? Where they both mean something else to each other. And you're not writing on the nose, right? Like if let's say that you're writing a scene and the point of the scene is I love you, right? You put that right in the middle and you build the scene around it. It's like a fleck of sand forming a pearl in an oyster. Then you just pull it out and the whole structure should hold in place around it. So you have a whole scene that's like in Field of Dreams, right? A father and son playing catch. Like what that scene is basically I love you, but that's not said. It's not even in the subtext. It's a father and son playing catch. The scene holds because you've anchored it around with real dynamics and real engagement. And so if you do that in your own life and you're observing and attuned to that in your own life, it gives you the skills to be able to create characters that are as faceted as your own flawed self.
Yes, a follow-up to that. As one journeys into self-knowledge, you have these moments kind of an epiphany, and there's one way of thinking about it, it's kind of cyclical and episodic, as if you have a moment and then there's more to learn and you have another moment, but you're never kind of getting at it. It's kind of like, to cut the grass every week in the summer, and it's just sort of the same thing. It grows and you cut it down and so on. But I think we all aspire at least to a sense that it's more of a spiral or a deepening, movement that is both has a kind of cyclical character, but also a deepening one. And so I wanted to ask your thoughts on what does it mean to revisit something in your own self-knowledge that leads to a deeper grasp. In memories like this, right? You can have an experience that you sort of have an initial sort of grasp, a sense of, that was scary or that was whatever, and then at a remove of a few days or a week, all of a sudden that experience is different, and then a year later and 5 years later and so on. So there's this kind of deepening engagement with the structure of reality in and through your own, self-understanding of your own self-understanding. And so I'm wondering if you have a sense of those structures in your own life as a writer of narrative, how your own self-story, as it were, gets deeper and truer over time.
It's such a good question. So the first thing is I'm an eternal optimist, which makes me somewhat simple at times. So I've had these moments where I have some new grasp of self-awareness, and I'm like, great, I got it now, right? Like the rest of my life should be really easy on this front. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Like Gilgamesh is trying to get back to the surface with that plant, you can't keep it, right? And so part of this is we're trying to occupy a state, right, that is something that we can hold on to. It takes training, it takes discipline, right? I talked with a number of you about the Romantic poets this week, right? That Wordsworth, life is but a birth and a forgetting, right? In some ways, you're trying to get back to the transcendentalist thought that the perfect pattern of God and realities in nature and in children, And we're trying to get back to that part of us where through trauma or pain or just engagement with the real world, we kind of close windows. I think of it as like you're on an airplane, like a big airplane, you shut all the windows to just pay attention where you're going. It's too much to have them all open when you're a little kid. Everything's open. Then things hurt you. A bee stings you, someone's rude, someone betrays you, and it's easy to shut down and shut down. I think that the weight that we seek to carry is, William Blake wrote Songs of Innocence, then Songs of Experience. So, little lamb, who made thee, is turned into tiger, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. What a mortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry. It's the horrible reality, fearsome nature of experience, but then he returns like that he who made the lamb made thee. And so to be able to weather the slings and arrows of experience and betrayal and shortcomings and your own, right? Your times where you feel betrayed and years later you reflect that you might have forced that into existence yourself. It's a process in a certain way of trying to get back to the purest or most honest version of yourself. And so that's something that the Romantic poets certainly were playing with and contending with, right? It's in theological thought, obviously that's a key motif. But I think in some ways when we talk about writer's voice, like what's a voice that's distinctive, the most distinctive voice you have to offer is the one that's most purely yourself. Like you're not gonna be the next Kurt Vonnegut, because you can't. Kurt Vonnegut makes no sense if you read Kurt Vonnegut. There's no reason any of those books should be readable. They adhere to no rules and they're captivating. But if you want to be a pale imitation of someone else, maybe you can make a living, right? But what you really want, if you want to be an artist, if you want to be a thinker, if you want to be an academic, if you want to be a visionary, is you want to be the purest imprint of yourself. And that voice or that vision is as unique as your thumbprint or your fingerprint. But that involves opening a lot of doors and having a sort of courage that you're willing to engage with things. It's the courage of a vulnerability of insight. It's like trying to look at the sun and it burns your eyes and then you look back at it, right? It's a process of kind of knowing, and then you don't write the cliched scene, right? You don't write the art that's a pale imitation. Those are things that you go through as you're trying to burrow to get to yourself and what you have to offer. And then if you can find that lane, you imperfectly try and hold to that.
I'm going to open it up for all of your questions in just a minute. But I first want to ask Gregg, in case we don't have time to ask him at the end, you've been here for 5 days, living with this
motley crew
of young folks, all working very hard at their studies here at Ralston College. And I just want to ask if is there anything any reflections you've had on your time here that lead to things that you'd like to share with them before we open up into questions?
It is exceedingly rare, and rarer every year and every decade, I think, to find a community that is bent towards truth and meaning, and where there's an authenticity of engagement. And so the fact that that's something that's being grown here in the culture so naturally, that's the main, you're 3 weeks from the end of formal studies, right? You're at the end of a process. There's something extraordinary that is happening here, that's taken hold here, that all of you're all part of the sourdough starter, right? It's year one, right? Some of you, it's the accidental penicillin. Like whatever was grown here is working. And part of what I was reflecting on this, so I'll detour and tell a quick story. My youngest daughter was a delightfully fat baby, like her elbows had chins, right? And as John Updike said, any self-respecting literary man is a Boston Red Sox fan. So I'm a Red Sox fan. And before they all of a sudden won all the championships and broke the curse, it was excruciatingly painful to be a Boston Red Sox fan, right? For years and years and years. And so there's one day that my wife tasked me, she went to the grocery store and tasked me, I was in charge of this daughter, so I shoved this delightful bundle of rotundity under my arm, and we're watching a Boston Red Sox game. And my wife went out shopping, and she came home a half hour later. We're watching this Red Sox game that was going how most Red Sox games went, especially in the early years. And she said, "How are you doing?" And Natalie turned around and screwed a big smile on her face, and she said, "Dada watching fucker ball." And it was the perfect encapsulation of the Boston Red Sox, what it means to be a baseball fan, the season. And one of the things that I realized, having this child who I thought would be, if not as capable of processing, certainly not parroting, was that I better change the filter about how I was viewing baseball and the Boston Red Sox, right? We can't change the reality of it, but if I'm watching and that from her watching with me was her interpretation of what the game should be called, perhaps there's a filter to be changed. Well, our culture is increasingly playing fucker ball. I think in our culture, in our politics, in our media, in our academic, in our education, in our arts, in our sport. It's unbelievable how there has been a filter of profanity in a certain regard, right? That is tilting over this lens. Profanity, which I felt all too vigorously as a very young father watching the Boston Red Sox. And there's a filter here that is in place that feels like it is unblemished. And there's an earnestness and a forthrightness and a willingness to engage, not just intellectually and not just academically, because that can get quite arid, right? Again, Milton's Lucifer is the intellect who falls in love with himself and believes he can do all things. But it's also the orientation, and the grounding in classics is a grounding in a kind of truth and beauty that has to move through. And it moves through how those of you that we've had the privilege of talking to talk about your relationships and your ambitions and your parenting and your spouses or girlfriends or your painting or your wrestling or your farming or your screenwriting or your writing of musicals or your publishing of sonnets. It's a through line that is moving through all the things that you're doing. And to have something that's captured that way culturally in a place around that's pouring a foundation that's this significant is remarkably special. And it's something to be cherished, but also you're charged with a moral responsibility when you leave here. And it's to not allow that to be blemished with other lenses, right? And to not allow yourself to be beaten down with the realities that are asking you just to compromise too much here or there. That doesn't mean you don't live in the real world. Michelangelo couldn't paint whatever he felt like on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, right? I can't get a movie pushed through a studio, whichever version that I want. But there's ways to steady yourself and move through to the constellations and to your North Stars that you've learned here. That's a moral responsibility, along with living a full life, because that's the point of the humanities and that's the point of liberal arts, right? And also, above all else, I think a moral imperative to be interesting and to be funny. Because if you lose your humor, none of the rest of it matters. And so if you go forth in the tradition of what you've been given here and carry that out into your communities and into your families and into your future endeavors, which will be various, far-flung, and pretty interesting. I mean, I can tell that already. It'll serve you in good stead.
So what I'm going to do now is open this up to anyone and everyone who has a question. I think that we're going to start with Dr. Headley, and then I'm going to move around and get as many of you as we can, and I may even pass this mic around if I can get it working. If you'd like to, we may or may not release this little conversation as a podcast.
So, maybe not with the baseball story.
Yeah, well,
we'll be redacted. Someone's got to paint britches.
I love you in the middle, though.
Huh?
Baseball story is the I love you.
That's fair.
Greg, I was very intrigued by your account of the difference between the novel and the film. That you said that the novel is much more of a collaborative enterprise. So is that a thought about the power of the imagination as opposed to the image in a way? That what you were suggesting with the work of the novelist is that there has to be this mediating role of the imagination, and that you as the novelist are, in a way, I think your term is intimation, that you have to intimate something. So that seems to me that's very interesting in terms of the way you set that up in the relationship between the inner and the outer, between the subjective and the objective. And maybe that fits in with your sort of cultural critique that you threw in. I mean, maybe one of the problems for many people in the kind of age of social media or whatever, and where the training of the imagination, where this mediating capacity of the written word has been diminished so much and replaced by quick-fire images, and I wonder whether this lack of a sort of mediating capacity is, in a way, has had this sort of skeptical effect in society, where, as it were, subject and object, the self and the world, have been sort of radically divided in a way that traditionally, one of the ways that this was mediated through great literature, through a common set of stories, common narrative.
That's interesting. So what's funny is, of course, screenwriting is a vastly more collaborative field, but what you're saying is, the suggestion is that there's a less passive role, is what I'm saying, in the reader than in somebody passively taking in a film and everyone seeing the same film. I do think that that's right, and I think that the first level is, I was talking to Professor Comlin today, who's talking about how language must be spoken, right? It's from the ground up, he was saying, right? You can't just learn, if you learn all the grammar and all the rules, then you apply it mathematically. It's not the truest way to engage in language. Well, the same thing's true for a story, right? If I come in very theoretically and abstractly and say, well, I'm going to have my second act reversal, and here's the structure, and I want to have this, and my theme is betrayal and loss. What bubbles up for me when I'm writing is, it's a scene, it's a moment, it's a telling to tale, right? It's me sitting on a subway, and I'll notice someone across from me who looks like they don't have a lot of money, and they've magic markered a part of their loafers, right, that are worn because they can't afford to buy new shoes. Like, what are the things that elicit a reaction that I'm sort of compiling? And when those filters start to get clogged up with captured, right? When I'm writing to theme, when I'm writing because this is going to be a story, but in the story, all this type of people are going to be villains, and all these type of people are going to be heroic, and all the language that I'm going to use is going to be subtly captured, right? It becomes something, we see this all the time in political discourse, right? Like, how many phrases become captured? How many terms, how many discussions become captured in political? It's exhausting. And the protection of that within language or within story or within narrative, that's a holy cause. That's a code that I have as an author. And so I can read a lot of times the occlusion of that by terms or imagery. Like you think about existing in the world today as a young person, as a high schooler. It's like, well, what do you have opinions on? Do you have opinions about epidemiology and COVID and Ukraine and abortion and Europe and globalism? Like, what is the list of things that you ostensibly as a 12 or 13-year-old have to have some knowledge and be on the right side of a constantly changing set of rules? And the encroachment of that, it's like clogging the arteries of language. And so there's so often as we're reading that there's a captured point here and there's a scene that's too on the nose here and we vilified this person this way and it's okay to turn this person into a straw man, but this person can't be. And it's there's such an encroachment. And I think the biggest thing that to drive for always is that sense of authenticity. So the perfect moment in writing in a narrative is when you're completely surprised by something and it makes perfect sense at the same time. Right? I'm sure there's a wonderful German word that you know for that we don't have in our language. But we've all seen that, like when we're in a film or you're reading a book and you're right on the verge of something that's that kind of turn, right? That kind of like The Usual Suspects, like right at the end when it's starting to rotate around and it happens and it's shocking, but it makes perfect sense. It's a sort of symmetry. You can't arrive at that if the engagement is with a world that has been premeditated and blocked out with fences and terms and characters and scenarios. We have this sort of propagandistic view that everything has to be blocked out in a certain way, and they're moving more stiffly across the narrative board like chess pieces with prescribed movements rather than fluidly and organically. So there's room for capture and corruption everywhere.
I see Dr. Bryson and then Mr. Chapman.
Right, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Greg. It's wonderful to have you visiting with us. And I'm gratified to know that you've noticed, as you would, that we have a room, especially in our students, bursting with creativity and a kind of artistic temperament in a way that's how we found them all. But I think at times, who this kind finds it frustrating, as you say, in an academic context, due to the kind of arid writing that sometimes belongs to the academy. And of course, you're a writer who's come up through, a major institution like Harvard. Did you find it, first of all, frustrating as a student, an aspiring writer, to write within an academic context, on one hand? And then, on the other, how would you advise this lot to go about their academic writing? I mean, some will go on to do academic things, maybe this is a term of agree for others, but in any case, they do have a few more hurdles to clear before the end of this year. What kind of advice would you impart? And did you yourself encounter that frustration as a soul in the academy?
So my series character, my novels, his code name is Orphan X. He's a government assassin, and he operates by the 10 Assassin's Commandments. And the one that's the most popular, that like soldiers have had tattooed on them, or it's on T-shirts, or people have jewelry made up, is the second commandment is how you do anything is how you do everything. And it's amazing how much this has resonated in this culture across the boards for people. And so what I'd say is that with academic writing, I loved academics and I loved writing, and I loved writing papers, is that if you're feeling that it's arid, you're not thinking about it deeply enough. There's always an opportunity to engage with a subject or to drill down enough. And look, you got to walk that line. You can't come in and be wildly innovative. I was just having a conversation this morning at breakfast with somebody talking about how, Picasso's realism is extraordinary, how he could paint, right? He didn't just start off Picassoing in day one, right? He could embody a whole form before he started to shift and mutate it. And so being a student is a process between humility and earned innovation. It's wonderful if you can teach your professor something, right, with every paper. It's wonderful if you can learn something and find something that's a creative motif, or that's a route in that's through fertile ground that you haven't plowed before. So if you're sitting there writing something and feel like, well, now it's time to do the comparison of these two and I need these footnotes, opportunity abounds in everything. And so you all know this. That's why you're here, right? This is an opportunity, an unusual, right, wildly improbable opportunity that you've all seized upon. That's everywhere. That's fractal, right? That's the aim is to constantly tack towards being a diamond why a diamond is engagement ring is it's the purest thing that you can give to try to aspire towards in a relationship. And so the aim is to have that everywhere. Now, you'll fail at it. I fail at it, right? We fail all the time. That's okay. Rush to failure. What matters is that it's a constant effort of the fact that everything that you're doing can be done exceptionally.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I jumped way back. So when Dr. Blackwood asked you about how do we create stories or narrative, I can't remember the exact question, you harkened back to this idea of Jung and these archetypal stories and Greek tragedy and this kind of very perennial ways of telling stories. Just going off that, I wonder what you make as an author writing stories of this kind of the late 20th century avant-garde movement of Finnegan's Wake by Joyce and Slaughterhouse-Five by Vonnegut or Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon. And what do you think of this very intentional, I don't know what you call it, you can call it deconstruction, but
so I'm talking as an author now, not as an academician. So for me, I tend to find that somewhat masturbatory. I love Ulysses. I don't ever want to pick it up again. I mean, I read it over the course of a semester in high school, whereas I love The Dead. The Dead hits me in my spinal cord, and it's so deeply, searchingly meaningful. There's moments of that in Ulysses, but I don't want to. Reading Ulysses feels like doing math with an abacus sometimes, right? And I'm not a Pynchon fan. To me, it's. Look, I think there's three kinds of writers, right? People write from their head, from their heart, and from their gut. Joyce writes from his head. Pynchon. These are movements to me that are very cerebral. They're cerebral down. For me, the most meaningful writing that I have, and again, I'm talking here about taste. It's like Joyce's reputation is not going to suffer any, right, from my criticisms of my own engagement with it. For me, and Fitzgerald for me writes from the heart, right? If you read Tender as the Night, and he sings and he soars, and I love that. I gravitate most to writers who write from their gut. To me, that's Faulkner, that's Raymond Chandler, right? That's James M. Cain. And there's a long tradition of writers writing from, that's actually Dostoevsky in a lot of ways. Of course, he's immensely, immensely spiritual, but the dirt and filth of the way that he writes through. I just reread Crime and Punishment, and when I was reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, he must have read Edgar Allan Poe, because Crime and Punishment is the telltale heart, right? It's the guilt that just works on you until you reveal yourself. And I went back through his letters and I found he was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe. So there's a cross-section constantly between genre writers and so-called literary writers, right? And so Camus' The Stranger was partly influenced by James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice, one of the great pieces of noir mystery, right? And so there's this constant overlap and stitching between. And yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I just have to ask. I find Faulkner to be, it's just so strange that you said he writes from the sound. The Sound and the Fury, Epsilon, these things, they feel me to be in the same vein.
So I
just wonder, why would you say he writes? I love Faulkner.
Yeah. So your Sound and the Fury, yes. I know what you mean, because you can break it down in a lot of ways like Ulysses, right? Well, let's put a pin in that. Light in August. Have you read Light in August?
No.
Read Light in August. As I Lay Dying, right? Yeah. So Light in August for me is just exceptional. Sound and the Fury, in a way, I think is Faulkner playing a bit. You see movements take holds through the different arts, right? And so you have cubism, right? Of maybe a better version of, a nude descending a staircase is to show her from 17 different angles, right? So things gravitate through the arts in different ways. You have Einstein's theory of relativity, a similar time, right? So then you have Faulkner playing and saying, Sound and the Fury, what if I tell one story from four perspectives, but don't tell you? And one of the tellers is mentally retarded, and one is a woman, and you have to piece together, right? One is a highly neurotic Harvard student about to commit suicide. So this proliferation of this idea through the arts, and again, this is why I think liberal arts education is so important, because you start to hit pattern recognition even before it gives you an almost preternatural sense of how things move. It actually started to move through the sciences, right? We mentioned Einstein, but also Carl Rogers, who you will know is the psychologist, the how did that make you feel psychologist, rather than the patient lying on their back and Freud sitting here smoking his pipe, he sits the patient up and looks at the patient, and his belief was that to understand a patient, you have to have unconditional positive regard. My wife's the psychologist in the family. But it's a full engagement with their perspective, to the point that he was literally talking to and figuring out how do you embody in your nervous system an ability to mirror the patient with a true act of listening, right? So that's another template in storytelling, right? Like when you're reading, as Jordan remarked in we talked about this a lot in Exodus, but if you're reading the story of Christ, we're not all Christ, right? We're the thieves, and we're Judas, and we're embodying all the parts of that. Reading is putting us in different nervous states. And so Sound and the Fury, as much as it is an exercise in the tradition of this unfolding of perspective across the arts and sciences, it's still it's dirty, it's seething with sexuality. I mean, Caddy is so sexualized, right? When he's in the tree and he's sort of, has a look up her skirt, and then they go up the hill and the grandfather's dead, and sexuality is paired with death. Like, he's mucking around in the shadow pretty heavily up to his elbows in that. Whereas for me, Joyce, when he says, the opening of this chapter is the phonetic spelling of all the fricatives of the sound of an orchestra warming up, that's not hitting me in the gut as much of a deeply ingrained sexual connection of neurons firing together, lived inside the stream of consciousness of a full psychological view of how memory is forged around sex and death. So I still put him in that camp, even though the trope is Rashomon-esque in the way that you're discussing more cerebrally. Yeah.
Okay, Joshua Faust.
Thank you so much for being here. One question that I have kind of also bounces off the idea you said of the openness that Mahalo has with its reader, leaving some of the doors open for the imagination. But you also mentioned William Blake, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the possibilities of a text paired with imagery. That's you've also involved in writing for comics or for screenplays. Whether or to what extent the pairing of images with texts can maintain that imaginative fertility without kind of locking.
Such a great question. Such a great question. And of course, I love Blake because he was just out of his mind, right? He was bipolar. He was on fire when he was painting this stuff, right? He was like channeling it almost. I was telling somebody a story about Byron, also heavily bipolar. I love the Romantic poets, right, so much. And Byron, when he was at Cambridge, there was a rule at Cambridge that you couldn't have dogs in your rooms. So he brought in a tame bear because there was no rules about having a tame bear. So he'd be swimming, you'd go visit him, and he'd be there paddling around with this bear in his club foot, practicing to swim the English Channel. But to your point, here's the thing with different arts that I've thought about this a lot, and I thought about this a lot in relation to comics. So real quick, we'll do a quick little moment. I think that the things that often are the most magnificent in a form are things that can only be accomplished in that form. So comics does something that can only be done in one other form, for instance. You're seeing the visuals, right, panel by panel. I describe when I write it, right? Close up on Batman, in the reflection of his eye, we see the Joker. Like, there's more direction than you do in a play if you're not an amateur screenwriter who wants to be patted on the head by a director and told to go back to your corner. And, the nickname for writers in Hollywood, I think it was Jack Warner, called them schmucks with Underwoods, the typewriters. There's very clear lanes. So when you're writing a screenplay, you're directing, pretending that you're not. You don't use the terms, you direct and you're spacing on the page. It's kind of an E. Cummings thing, but us screenwriters can have that powwow later over a pint. But in comics, basically, instead of now everything has to be seen or heard, you're holding an old-fashioned camera and you can take 3 to 5 snapshots per page. That's it, right? You can't show Batman hitting someone, you show wind up, the moment of contact, or the aftermath. Well, that was pretty cool. So I started to import that into novels. And I have certain scenes, like an action scene I write with Orphan X, for instance, where 2 cops come to arrest him, and he's never going to kill a cop because he's a vigilante with a code, but he's not a savage. And he just very calmly describes to them in a crowded cafe in DC, if they seek to arrest him, what he will do, the ways that he will injure them and use all of the surrounding materials as props to sort of defeat them and be on his way. And then I end the chapter and I never showed it. So this was a trick I picked up from comics that is importable. And then 3 chapters later, these poor cops show up the next time they make an appearance, and they're just wearing all the matching injuries that he described. But I skipped that scene and let the reader fill that in. So it's another example of me wanting to show respect, or to have a reader be kind of in on a joke as readers become much more pop culturally aware. Y'all have seen plenty of action scenes, right? What are ways to tell them new? But in comics, there's something amazing. There's captions and dialogue, and they're different. Dialogue is what they're speaking, and captions are what they're thinking. So a lot of brooding Batman, Punisher, right? There's a lot of brooding captions with the guys who are alone. So I wrote this one comic called Fool Killer, very violent little piece of comic writing. And there's an assassin who was brought in from the East Coast, and his nickname was Sickle Moon, right? And so I have a scene on an airplane. I actually make fun of Michaela, Jordan's daughter, in this, which is really funny. Remind me to tell you that. That's a stronger spirits story, however. But so there's this big hulky guy who's clearly like this assassin. He's on an airplane. He's smashing luggage into other people. He's leaning his seat back, and there's this pale, frail little loser of a guy sitting behind him who's constantly kind of getting banged up. And the captions are describing this assassin, right, coming in, how much he hates traveling, how irritable he is, what he's going to do when he kills these people. It's this menacing set of captions where you're in the mind of this assassin. We get all the way through the flight, and he's at his luggage check, and the little wimpy guy behind him who's wearing a hat stabs him in the kidney with a ballpoint pen, and as he crumbles to die on the floor, gets into a cab, and he takes his hat off, his old-fashioned cap, and there's a sickle moon scar on his birthmark. And you realize that the captions that you've been reading the whole time don't belong to the obvious player, right, who you would associate it with, but to somebody else. So there's, again, this pleasing moment for the reader where the reader is in on piecing together something in a way that's pleasing. You can't do that in a novel. You can't do that in a movie. You can't have Tom Cruise providing a voiceover and really it turns out that it's Woody Allen, right? And so to seize upon something within a medium that can only be accomplished in that medium turns it into the purest form. So if you're going to be William Blake. Don't be me writing Willie Julie in the Case of the Buried Treasure with my crayon illustrations in 5th grade, right? William Blake being on fire the way that he was, and to supplement the poetry with the image, it's a transcendent, almost a new version of an interplay. The thing I did realize after I thought long and hard about this is there's one other art form that lets you do that in comics, which is dialogue and caption at the same time. And that's opera, it's particularly Wagnerian opera, right? So in the Ring cycle, Siegfried and Sigmund, right, they come in and he's singing, "May I warm my hands by the fire," right? They're having their dialogue, but the orchestra is playing the leitmotif, the love leitmotif below. So in a way, I was thinking about this, and I think that in a way, the Wagnerian orchestra is the id, right? And the dialogue or the book is the ego. And so it's a very weird overlap, but there's something that's so pleasing. If you have the patience and time to get an ear for Wagnerian opera, it's so pleasing because the orchestra is constantly whispering to you these leitmotifs that can run even across the current of what it is that you're observing. So with the forms, if you're going to use something in a form, again, like we're talking about Picasso, make sure that if you innovate, that you're doing something, that you're breaking the form, or you're trying to maximize it in a way that's something that can only be accomplished in that form.
Other questions? I see Elijah and then Elisa.
Gregg, what most motivates you to do the work that you do?
So one of my favorite quotations on writing is Joan Didion. And she says, "I write so I know what I think." I think my motivation is twofold. If I'm not writing and sublimating fairly heavily for multiple hours a day, I think I'm an insane, crazy person. So that's number one. It's like an edge of sanity it's like not working out, right, for a prolonged period of time. It's a kind of exercise that it's a requirement in how I need to express myself and figure out what it is that I'm thinking, contending with. And language is the barrier. I think, one of the a guiding motif or a guiding symbol for me is the yin yang. And it's not just that you want the sine wave between chaos and order, right? And the artist is on the edge of chaos trying to order it enough, right? But the two eyes to me are always where you want your feet. You want to be Colossus, right? You want to be Colossus of Rhodes, that you're astride that line. And so for me, writing is very much about holding that balance. I think the other reason why I like to write is it's the only chance I have to speak for 400 pages without being interrupted. Which is a distinctly Blackwoodian trait. Now that I've met Tim and Jesse, I have to tell you, they're a loquacious, brilliant bunch.
Not that you know it tonight. Annalisa Gomez.
You had mentioned how these novels, these things that you set up are very much so that the reader can see and sort of create these things along the way, potentially even see themselves in these those moments of connection. How much when you're writing are you sort of envisioning that it's not just a moment for these readers to see themselves in the writing, but to sort of to learn something about themselves, to in a sense have those moments of discovering and potentially creating the self?
It's a very secondary concern. I don't actually think about the readers that much when I'm writing. I mean, I do in terms of the craft, right? Like I imagine if you're chiseling out the living image from the stone, like you have some awareness that people need to see and understand it, but I'm not thinking consciously, how are readers gonna engage with this? Is this gonna be offensive? Are they gonna learn with this? Is this gonna be upsetting? Unless it's just in the delight of the tautness of the fishing line for the story, right? So it's, to me, the focus is almost entirely on the story. And then sometimes that'll dip in and I'll think about that, but a lot of times I'll go back and pare that stuff out necessarily, because what you want to do is convey something that's ambiguous. It's not too on the nose, so you don't, like a great story isn't edifying through any of the first few logical stages of awareness, right? It's more deeply resonant in a way, I think, that you contemplate and learn from the spine out instead of from the prefrontal cortex down.
Next question, Lydia.
Can you speak to the nature of being such a Renaissance writer across many styles and how that has led you into the navigation of many different parts of the business? And is there... being someone equally interested in the de-escalation of polarization and having not just a vested interest in your writing career, but in really good stories and how they maybe impact people's lives, while also being a business person. I know that's a lot to throw at you, but kind of with the relationship.
Well, let me take the polarization part first, because that's a little easier, and then we'll go to the business part. The same things that I was talking about of seeking to avoid cliches in writing, right? Like why I'll go get my dumb self choked out on a mat to avoid writing, and then everything went dark, right? He fell like a ton of bricks, right? Like all the cliches we're trying to avoid. What we're talking about in one of the common themes that's running through all of this, including the discussion of Ralston, is an unerring, a plenty erring, not unerring, orientation towards authenticity, because we fall in and out of that all the time. And politics, it's the same thing. I mean, I remember I grew up as a relatively liberal, I'm from a secular Jewish family. My parents are from the East Coast, but I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Like I always joke, like if I was more on brand, I'd be like a Tesla, right? It's like I was very of a secular world in a way. And I remember when politicians in the 80s would talk about family values, right? I always heard it as such a cudgel of like, oh great, like here it is again. It's Pat Buchanan or whoever it was. Then you get older and I have kids and I get married. I'm like, hey, these family values, like, it seems like I have a family, I should have values around a family, right? But if things come in through a way that is perceived as captured or corrupt, right? If I throw out a term to say, how many terms are laid in now, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, mansplaining, Nazi in any context applied to anything that has to do with any rule we don't like, back and forth. And every topic is laden with dog whistles. And I don't even mean advertent ones, right? Like when everybody would say, well, Trump's dog whistling all this racism. It's like, I don't believe that all of those things are overt choices anymore, that when Chuck Schumer stands up and gives a speech and he's using phrases like people don't even know, but what we're trying to avoid is captured language and storytelling. And so the advice that I would give when I was engaging with often moderate Democrats, but also a lot of conservatives, in my last trip to DC, I only met with conservative leadership, is talk authentically, right? Talk in real ways with real language. The minute you use captured language, voters are so exhausted by this, right? The minute you use one term, you're done. Use one term the wrong way, right? And that's a mirror up both sides of it. I have the exact same discussions with Democratic leadership as Republican leadership, conservatives and liberals, right? And so the moving out of the cliched into the real is something that you want if you want authentic art or if you want authentic political engagement. If you want fundraising, no. If you want propaganda, no. If you just want sales to tuck into a ascendant trend in the culture, right? If you want to go write some version of a film that can get made because it's politically exigent at the time, then you're not going to. So it's telling stories is the same everywhere, right? Talk about a specific, talk about an individual, right? Set the tone. If you're telling a story, engage the senses. If you're writing a book, right? How do things feel? How do they taste? What's the smell, right? Like you want to bring the senses to life when you're doing something. So politician giving a rote speech of like, I believe that universal healthcare is a right. And it's like, tell us, like, what drove you? What's the moment you decided to run? What was the experience you had? Jordan and I met in DC and we took 10 Democratic members of the House and 10 Republicans and sat them down at a table like this and had a dinner. And we said, look, no filibustering and no overtly political topics. Why'd you go into politics? What was your inspiration? What's your need for it? They went around the table. Every person was more exceptional than the one before. And you wouldn't have been able to even guess what political party they were from if you start from a common shared set of human engagement, right? And so that gets back to what we've been talking about a lot, which is start to the human and the uncaptured, right? And it's more universal. Start with the specific. So polarization, it's the same rules. It's like, don't you know how to tell a story? I went with a friend of mine who's a big screenwriter, right? It's 4-quadrant entertainment, right? When I go on book tour, I spend an equal amount of time in red states and blue states. I'm not writing stories for one crew. A lot of people do now. A lot of politicians do. So the polarization, getting the story right, one of the things I often say is based on my proclivities, right? So I'm an artist, I'm super high trade openness, like ridiculously so, right? My genetics, my experience, my family, my environment, all these things, I come at the world naturally through a liberal perspective, but true liberal, as I often say, is handshake distance across the aisle from a conservative. We're right there, right? But when I've really drilled down on any topic, I think if I could be fully embodied and evolved and integrated, I'd be 50% liberal and conservative. I'd be yin yang. I also think that's where the country necessarily is, that you're in opposition. That's a whole other discussion because I think you need liberals and conservatives to navigate complex change for a whole variety of reasons that can be distilled through the 5 personality traits. So politics, it's the exact same rules of storytelling, right? It's just trying to get them to understand that, and especially when that hurts them with fundraising. But the same thing's true with getting eyeballs if you're Fox News or MSNBC, right? There's political and market reasons that drive people to solicit the views from the extremes that are sort of holding this big, vast middle of people who agree on almost everything in a sort of hostage state. The business side, there's a million different kinds of answers for that, depending on what you want to do. For me, one of the most important things was that I never wanted to take work that I wasn't passionate about. That's why when I sold my first book, I didn't go buy a nice car. It was like money in the tank, right? Because I think that if you engage in work that isn't along the lines of your truest bearing, no matter what field you're in and no matter what you do, you dissipate your talent. Right. So I meet people all the time when I'm out on book tour who are like, well, I really wanted to be a novelist, but I needed a job. So I've been an accountant for 30 years or 40 years. And when I retire, I'm going to write a novel. It's like, how do you think that in the choices that you make, you can't hit pause when you're 22, do a whole other career and then just resume where you were? Like what we are is our focus. What we are is where we put our attention. It's the most powerful thing we have. It's literally like half of our brain is wired to our visual field to track movement. Like literally what we look at is how we are built. And so for me, I didn't want to figure out any way I could get staffed, let's say, on a TV job, which is an actual job. Comics need to be written. People need to write Batman and Superman. TV shows need staffs to write them. No one cares if you write a novel. No one cares if you have a creator-owned comic, and nobody cares if you write an original screenplay, right? So those are three things ain't nobody waiting on. But to do it, I didn't want to be, in a writer's room where I'm making, it sounds palatable, you make hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars being in a writer's room writing Alf or The Golden Girls or, one of these shows that, which are actually wonderful and entertaining, like forms of entertainment, but they're not where I was. So for me, the business side, I took a real seriousness in the business side only to learn it to be protective about my resources to continue to be able to write the way I want. And then fortunately, I have a very commercial sensibility. I mean, I'm writing big knockdown commercial thrillers, right? I write horror, I write action, I write all these things that are really meaningful to me and for which there is a market that I'm grateful for. But business to me is in a different place than with a lot of people. I'll tell you another thing that I learned, and I think this is true for life. I think it's also true why having a culture, I was thinking a lot about where you all are going to go off to once you scatter once more to the four corners of the earth. Who you associate yourself with, it's such a part of who you are. And I remember early on, I went through 4 agents on the publishing side, more than that on the Hollywood side. And I remember thinking there's this thing of like, well, I just need kind of like an asshole agent. Like the joke of the agent is like, he's an asshole. It's like, yeah, but he's my asshole, like doing my bidding. Anyone who you're in association with at some point, right, reflects on you. Every aspect of your community. And so, there were times where I moved through feeling like I had to be represented in a certain way. And maybe I even did, right? Maybe I didn't have the right leverage to choose in a better way or to be as open to it. But I remember I had one agent for a while who was like pretty great. He was only like 5% sleazy, but if you work with somebody over time, right? Like, do you want to be married to someone who's 95% faithful? Like over time, transactions over time. And it's hard when you enter a field that's that hard bitten edge of the commercial that everybody wants to be. Everyone wants to be a writer. Everyone wants to be an actor. Everyone wants to be a movie star, a musician, right? Of how you hold that and where you hold. I think I probably wish I knew even more or had even greater awareness of tacking even more towards building out in those ways and holding really clean in those regards. And I did a pretty good job of it. But like right now, my whole team, I mean, I have agents, in different territories. I have primary agents here in Hollywood, lawyers, like it's a big enterprise. I never worry about ethical misstep, double dealing. Did they lie to one publisher and not another? So it's like, I'm in a fortunate place now where I'm in a position that my representation feels like a reflection of the best version of myself who I want to be. So that's really important in the business side. But, it's weird because when you start, you need your agent more than they need you. It's a very unusual process of employment, and by the time you're successful, they need you and you can start to set and dictate the culture more. So it's hard sometimes early on to figure out who you onboard and what deals you make with what people as you're finding your way. It's very tricky, but, keep eyes open.
Hey, what are your top 3 professional failures and what did you learn from them?
I think that's enough time for today. Wow. I think the first thing that happened, so I sold this, I was really young. I sold my first book. I was 22 years old, right? I was right out of graduate school, decent amount of money. And I felt like I was like, if I'd had a day job, I would have walked in and quit it, right? Like I felt like I've arrived. This is it now, right? Here's short stories. Everyone will publish them. Everything's happening. And it wasn't the case. My first book was either an exceedingly modest success or a failure, right? It was like right on the line. I mean, I think I sold and it was fine. It was fine. It wasn't at all what I'd hoped that it would be. And that was tough. I have a friend who had a great line. She said, God, when I sold my first book, I felt like I won the lottery. And then I realized I'd only won a lottery ticket. And so that first, and my wife, who doesn't often mince words, said, I'm so glad you weren't just a smashing success young, because you would have been intolerable. There's a lot of leavening and humility around having to reconstitute. And then it took 2.5 years to sell my second book. And then that didn't do very well. And then I needed a new publisher. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I didn't know that. And so same thing happened with my first movie I had made. I had a movie made called The Book of Henry. It took me 18 years to have it made. Little tiny movie. For like 3 days, Spielberg was thinking of directing it because he always wished that he directed American Beauty. And I met with the president of DreamWorks, and she said, when did you write this? It breaks all kinds of rules, the screenplay. Every rule that you would want to break. And I said, I wrote the rough draft when I was 20 years old. She goes, before you knew better. And that was really the case. I mean, in a normal situation, it would have been received to mixed reviews. But it came out and it was eviscerated. It starred Naomi Watts. We brought in, the director I had was on hiatus between Jurassic World, which grossed $1 billion, and one of the Star Wars movies, and he shot my little tiny $12 million movie. Giacchino scored it. He did the score for Up. We had one of my friends who's the lead singer for a band called Guster out of Boston wrote the song for it, and then Stevie Nicks sang it. It was the most wonderful production process imaginable. And it came out and we just got eviscerated critically. And that was due to, there was some political complications ascendant in the culture around the director in certain ways and around the project, which aren't worth getting into. So there was some external circumstances, I think, for why knives were sharpened. And even under ordinary circumstances, it was a bit of it's a confounding script. But that was brutal. And the head editor of Deadline Hollywood, that's the biggest online thing, specifically laid the blame and fault of the project on my feet in a video review. He said, the director fared well and Naomi Watts did just fine, everything else, but really the failure here was the screenwriting. And I thought, we have so little control as screenwriters over projects. It was really funny, but the town, it was not a good reception. I think part of that was, it was very interesting, which was one of the things I learned from that was it was this magnificent experience having this movie made, but the experience doesn't necessarily translate into financial success or accolades or critical attention. And so it was a real, in some ways, bracing dislocation for me of the experience that was magical, of having it made that was magical. I never would have had it made without this director. I mean, it's a movie that never would have got made for a whole bunch of reasons. But this amazing experience, and then that thought, which I've had before, which is, hey, I can read all my good reviews and believe them, but then I have to believe all the bad reviews, right? That to some extent, you have to be separate from that and from the world of criticism and reception. Because if you believe that, then you're tacking in all the wrong winds and weather conditions. So that was kind of rough. I have another one which this one I'm going to tell the story of an apparent failure that turned into a success. That's another thing, is you never really know what constitutes failure in the short term, right? Plenty of Chinese proverbs about that. But when I wrote for Marvel with a good measure of success, and when DC came to kind of steal me over, you have the clandestine meeting with DC. DC and Marvel are always sort of competing. And they said, look, we'll give you, which was a deal Marvel had made. The executive editor of Marvel was a fan of some of my novels, so I had a lot of room to choose any character I wanted to recreate out of the vaults. And for me, it was the Punisher, because Punisher was end all be all. But DC asked me, and they said, you could do anything you want. And I said, what I really want to do is do a origin story for the Penguin, Batman's Penguin. And the reasons for that are manifold. I mean, they were flipping over the universe on what was called the New 52, where they just decided the universe was too overladen and they need to reinvent it. So I wound up reinventing a lot of the villains for them. But Penguin's the only one in Batman's rogues gallery who's sane, right? Riddler's insane, Joker's insane, Mr. Freeze, like God only knows what he is. And also I thought if you're Penguin, he's short, he's unattractive, he's obese, right? He's this like sort of vile creature. If you're him, Batman's a bully. And that was really interesting to me. And so the Penguin was most associated in the 1970s with this sort of the ridiculous Meredith Burgess portrayal that was very over the top. This is before you all were born, but he's a very jokey, ridiculous character. And he'd never had his version of the Killing Joke. That's Alan Moore's great version of the Batman origin story. And I wanted to give him that and make it real. So the moment of apparent failure was they did a poll to see what readers at one of the biggest comic websites, and comic community is full-blown insanity, right? It's just like, it's bananas. Which comic are you most looking forward to? And they listed like 10 of them. And my Penguin, my reinvention of the Penguin for Batman got 0.0017% of the vote. And it had my favorite all-time anonymous internet comic where somebody just said, "I'm so glad Hurwitz's mom voted for him." Like nobody wanted to see a Penguin origin story. So that was pretty funny, especially when they told me, like, you can have the keys to the kingdom. Like, you don't want Green Lantern, you don't want, Superman. And that comic came out, this little comic that I did came out and got significant critical attention. People wound up loving it. Readers came to it slowly. It didn't remotely sell. Oh, so from there, basically, they asked me on to a major Batman title, Batman the Dark Knight, and then I wrote that for 2 years with some of the best artists in the world. It never sold Batman, I did a Batman with David Finch, right? I worked with Alex Maleev and Ethan Van Sciver and many other names that I'm sure in the constant vernacular in Professor Conlon's course of comic book artists here, renowned classicists. But, the Penguin, it never sold that way, but it really was like when they did the TV show Gotham, the actor who played Penguin cited that as a major piece. And then, Colin, like it just has been in the mix around this as this new foundation. And so what I learned with that was if you're given the opportunity, right, to do the biggest thing or the thing you love, sometimes they line up together. But if they don't, you always do the thing you love, right? The thing that you love, the thing that you have to create, right? Whether that's a university or a work of art or a department or a corporation or a sports team, the thing that you have a compulsion to create, right, that you're following is the thing I think that leads to greatest rewards in every way in the long term, even if not the short term.
Conan.
I wanted to ask, as a writer, what's your biggest source of helpful feedback been, and how has that changed from when you were starting out your career to being more established?
What's my most helpful source of input for any reader, you mean? Well, I used to really gravitate to discipline, right? I mean, I was an athlete. I was a pole vaulter in high school and college. And writing is not dissimilar in that every day first of all, there's an inherent selfishness that you have to have, right? If you're an athlete and you're training, that's your training time. You have to have that, right? If you're going to be serious, if you're going to compete. And if you don't make it sacrosanct, everything else is more important. Everything else is more important than training day 37 for a track meet that's going to be on day 365. Everything's more important than writing day 17 or 123 on your novel that no one's waiting for and no one really cares if you finish, right? If you don't elevate that to the sacred within your life and hem that in and protect that with discipline, like no one else is going to care and you're not going to get anywhere. And so like ass and chair time is essential. Like, are you getting the time? Are you training, right? Or is there a regularity to it? And I think how part of that has changed, I mean, a lot of ways I started really young and I was just like willing myself to this with everything. The other thing is that, per my conversation about writing from the gut, to me, writing is a very physical engagement, right? Like I buy these really loud keyboards that sound like old-fashioned typewriters, like where they're clackety-clacketing. I want it to sound like a typewriter. It feels to me, I want it to feel like it's carpentry almost with the words as I'm hammering and getting them down. And so I think when I was younger, I was very focused on the discipline and the physicality around the process and adhering to that process and that sort of discipline. And I think as I get older, with an awareness that there's so many, humans are so remarkably different. It's just, you can't even believe it, right? You just can't even believe how different people are. And I think that that's where I start to tack more towards talking to artists of different stripes about figuring out their access to their most authentic internal expression, whichever way they find that. Some people might not find that through this sort of, as a novelist, it's pretty hard if you don't have discipline. I mean, it's pretty hard. But for other people, maybe that's not the primary way in. I tend to build up from ritual and from training, right, and then access it. But I think the importance of avoiding cliche by having a greater awareness of yourself, because writing for me is a process of becoming undeceived, right? If I write a scene that's how I think a scene should go, it's probably not that interesting a scene. It's probably been written a bunch of times before me. I think that process of self-interrogation moves to the fore with me more and more.
I think there was a double sense of the question, and the other sense of input, well, the other sense was feedback. What are the key sources of feedback or criticism you've received that have made you better over time?
I see. It's really weird because I don't have I wouldn't say I've had any hard and fast mentors in writing. In a way, part of it is, I think, as an artist, like one of the aims is to be singular, right? And so what that means is an enormous amount of reverence and humility before people who've come before you who do it well, who you marvel at, right? But I always wanted to sort of tack my own course. In terms of feedback, one of the things that I've decided is I always chose the people I listened to very, very carefully, right? To make sure, if you listen, there's a lot of people who jump into these writers groups, like kind of at great ease, and everyone's giving feedback, and it's very hard to maintain sort of singularity of vision. But one of the things I realized is if somebody really knew what they were talking about from an editorial perspective, and you can tell, and it's not merely subjective, it's just not. There are notes you can give that are better than other notes. There's things you hear when somebody responds to your work that hits you right in your, I kind of knew that, but was covering it, right? That word that doesn't quite rhyme or fit, the rhythm that's slightly off, the character beat that you kind of thought you could get away with, or you're smart enough to write around. When they poke at you and you're aware enough that they're poking at all the vulnerabilities that you well deserve to be poked at, then the rule becomes you have to listen to them, but also be careful at taking people literally, right? So part of the job is if somebody's a trusted interlocutor, your job is to listen. I talked a bit about Rogers setting the conditions of the nervous system to really listen properly. And what listening means often, and I'd say I learned this piece a bit more from the studio side, because if you don't listen, sometimes you get studio notes and they're just idiotic. There's plenty of studio executives and producers who are brilliant, right? There's plenty who are not. So when you get a really frustrating set of notes from the studio and they're clearly are inane, you can split that between like the artists and the suits. Like it's easy to kind of turn them into a monolith. But it's to your benefit to try to, before you're at a point, as I feel like I mostly am now, that I can choose my creative partners even at a studio level, then you want all the input and you're trying to fix things, and there's a way you feel like you're rowing together, at least for some period of time. But the job is to sort of excavate beneath the editorial anxiety that's expressed. People don't know why they have reactions to things. We don't know why we believe half the things we believe. We don't know why we say a lot of the things we believe. And so if you get a note, let's say I got a note on my screenplay at one point from an executive who said, oh, the script's, it's really slowed down here at the start of the third act. I went back and looked at it. It wasn't slow at the start of the third act, right? So it's easy to just set that down and be like, he's a suit, he's stupid, right? It's done. I'm moving on. He doesn't understand writing. That's why I'm a writer and he's not. But if I spent more time and really consider that, part of what might have happened is the second act had a lot of bloat in it, but he didn't notice. So he's reading through, getting more and more frustrated, and when he got to page 93 at the turn of the third act, it pushed up into consciousness and he wrote a note then, right? And so that exercise of trying to listen to excavate what people's meaning is again, we talk about trying to open doors within yourself. It's like that's useful in a partner if you're married, or if you have a kid, or if you have a friend, or you have a political discussion, or you're trying to reach a new voter, or you're trying to learn something from somebody who's telling you things that might be unflattering, but beneath your defenses, they might be things that you want to hear, right? And so the feedback is a lot more about the person and their engagement around the piece, and if you find that valid, and if so, pay a lot of attention and don't take it literally necessarily.
Emily and then Costa, and then Bradford.
Do you know the documentary Crumb?
Yes.
Okay, so when you see what he's drawing, you see pretty clearly like, oh, this is what he's thinking about all the time, and he's putting it on paper, and we kind of like know his neuroses and insecurities through looking at his work. But with writing, it's much easier to obscure those sort of things. But do you ever have moments when you're writing that you feel like, oh, someone's just like seeing my soul right now in kind of a bad or embarrassing way?
I think by the time that I've confronted those things that I'm willing to lay bare in a way that I can push them out in a way that is authentic, I'm no longer ashamed of them.
So you don't use writing as therapy?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, but by the time it's on the page, I'm like, yeah, that's something I've thought about. That's some part of me that I've kind of pulled. Look, the pot of gold that the dragon guards, to go back to our, shop-worn hero's journey at this point, that represents sort of, look, it can represent a lot of things, but one of the key things it represents is self-awareness, right? That's why if you hole up in in fear from something that's an external threat, like Grendel comes and eats you, right? Or the dragon comes and eats you, right? So it's your voluntary exploration of the unknown, usually with a shield with culture on it, like you're guarded to some extent by your culture, but you go into the cavernous, devouring unknown to face a dragon. There's no reason a dragon should guard a pot of gold, because what the hell's a dragon need gold for, right? But if you can slay the dragon, that gold is the release of some self-awareness, right? Whether that's shadow integration, whether that's anima integration, whether it's a piece of yourself that you never knew. And these hero journeys, it's not like you have one and then you're all squared. I mean, we have them every time we go into the unknown, we have that. And you have to be willing to lose parts of yourself and suffer through the trials and kill parts of yourself to be aware of what's new. And I would say by the time that I've dug into something sufficiently to write about it or to push it out in a way that I hope is authentic and is laid bare on the page, I don't care if people see it, because the shame of it is between me and my own psychology that I haven't yet shown the light on. But if I've gone through that process, the last stage of the hero's journey is you come back to the society with something that you have. That's the story. That's Grendel's paw, right? Beowulf comes back and nails it over the mantle. It's like, that's how it's done. You're scared of something? Don't hole up and hide from it. It gets bigger and bigger. It'll come eat you. You go out, you fight it, you learn something, you bring it back to other people and you hold it up for them to look at. You put it on the wall. So.
I have a silly second question. Do you have a favorite word?
Rambunctious.
Costa.
You mentioned something about the courage of vulnerability, and that made me think of what's traditionally described as the feminine hero's journey. And so at the same time, you said that's kind of an important part of the personal creative process, but also you're going and training with Navy SEALs and practicing martial arts and all this stuff. So I'm curious what you might say about the significance of the feminine versus the masculine hero's journey, both in the creative process and in the story. What do you say about that? And on a separate note, if you find journaling useful as a kind of way.
So I don't journal because for me it's just a busman's holiday. I mean, I've been writing as many waking hours as I can from the beginning of time that I can remember. And so when I'm done writing, I don't want to write more. I want to drink, it's like, or I want to go for a walk, or I want to wrestle with my dogs, or go to a movie. But it's immensely useful earlier, right? Like I had younger in a career. And for some people all the way through, some people keep journals. Again, whenever you give artistic advice, it's like, take anything I'm saying that fits and throw out anything that doesn't, right? Like that's about being singular. Now for the feminine journey, this is really interesting. I think for the first part of my life, through 40, we talked a lot about yin yang, right? We talked a lot about integration of different parts and how the hero's myth is about that. And, I think I was not obsessed, let's say, as a lot of young men and women are too, right? With shadow integration, right? That's a big part of it. What are all the parts of me that are unseen? What are the things I should be afraid of? What are the things I'm willing to step into and embody? But the second half, and part of how I know Stephen is through a relationship I mentioned with Jordan. Jordan taught me Jung, right, when I was an undergrad, and that was what my thesis was on, Dr. Peterson. And so I'm very, Jung just laid down on the way my brain works. I have a friend who's living with me right now who is a born-again Christian who was raised as the son of a missionary all through China. And what's funny is at different times in our lives, we've had these matching trials or tribulations that seem to rhyme. And he'll describe it in evangelical Christian language. And for me, it's like an exact overlap of a Jungian discussion, right? So it's like that's that thing where things just line up on top of each other. And so there's obviously so many different ways to do this, but this to me was the most resonant. Well, after shadow integrations where you have anima integration, right? Or if you're a woman, you have animus integration. You integrate then the feminine aspect of yourself. And I think that second piece in a lot of regards is what's most lacking right now in the culture, right? Where we have ascendant toxic femininity and toxic masculinity, by which I don't mean men and women. I mean femininity and masculinity, which thank God I'm talking to a room full of classicist scholars to understand that distinction, rather than if I'm giving an interview on MSNBC. But the anima integration is the part where you can't know, it's Oscar Wilde. How do you know what's enough unless you know it's too much? Like part of being younger is to make mistakes. It's to break your nose. It's to get choked out. It's to trip. It's to break your collarbone. It's to be vain, to get torn down, to get stripped down, to get out over your skis, to tumble. Part of the process, I think, of anima integration is the aspect where you have a fully formed, I'm going to now shift to personally because this is different for everybody, but a fully formed and evolved view and notion of the feminine, the transcendent feminine in a lot of ways. And when you're aware of that with all of the sensitivity and value and deep and powerful forcefulness and innovation and creativity and all those things, and integrate and find those parts in yourself in relation to it, I think that's where all of a sudden you turn the corner into something that's much more integrated and embodied. And so, for instance, tacking back to a phrase that Jordan researched at great length, which is the meek shall inherit the earth, which never rang true for me. Like meekness is not a trait that I'm particularly fond of or want to tack to. But what he realized that it meant when he went back and did a lot of scholarship on this is meek in some ways is a translation, imperfect translation for those who have swords but keep them sheathed. So if you have a sword but keep it sheathed, all of a sudden that means you can be transformational, right? You're a peacemaker. But you better believe that if you draw that sword, that you know how to use it, right? So it's an iteration on, speak softly and carry a big stick in a certain way. And so the aspect of anima integration in a lot of ways is like, once you have that, then you become a more embodied, it's not something you have. If you can imperfectly embody it at different times when you're not getting in your own way, right? And you can have that integrated state, you can engage in things in ways that are much more transformational because your shadow is in concert with your ego, right? And your anima, if you're a man, is in concert with your masculinity, and they harmonize. And so that's where you can be transformational because you don't, but if you're trying to skip the whole process of shadow integration and just telling everyone to keep their sword sheathed, like what do you have to offer? You have to offer if you, like a peacemaker keeps the sword sheathed because they have learned the great damage that comes from drawing it, right? And are loath to do so. And this applies, I'm not literally and figuratively, and more often figuratively, right? So even to some sense creatively, in some sense relationally, emotionally, all these different ways. And so to try and hold that aspect in place also, I think, is essential.
Bradford, then Aaron, and then we'll see how much time we have.
I'm curious what you think about the relationship between ethics and storytelling. It seems to me a lot of the great books, Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, they contain wisdom about how to live a good life, and then after we read their stories, we can carry that wisdom with us and apply it on a daily basis. But the danger of trying to write morally significant stories is that it turns into propaganda or moralizing. I wonder, is that a consideration that you think about, and how do you think some of those great books successfully do that without turning into just mere propaganda?
That's a great question. So there's two forms of ethics of writing I think about. One of them are the ethics in terms of my responsibilities as an artist or as a writer. It's separate from what you're asking, but I think it's also relevant because it gets to it in a way indirectly. So for instance, for me, the story is always paramount. Always. If I go do a bunch of research and do mixed martial arts fighting and it's really cool and I want to write about all that and put it in the book so everyone can see how smart I am, or if I want to come back and have a bunch of brilliant observations about some opera that I listened to in the thriller that 90% of my readers aren't going to get because it's there to reflect on me. There's a line a friend of mine has about research, a derogatory line where she'll say, oh, your research slip is showing, right? You don't want to show all your research. You want to have just what's right for the story. So I need to research the whole iceberg and then make sure only the tip of the iceberg gets in. So the first answer is only things in service to the story. However, it can't stop there, meaning I have a Navy SEAL, he was a UDT, SEAL Team 6 plank holder, reading all my weapons and ammunition. You can't get weapons. Two things you can't do in a book is you can't get weapons wrong or you'll hear about it forever, and you can't kill a cat because the cat people come after you and you're done. But I need subject matter experts. And so I wrote a book that dealt very heavily with the cartel, Mexican culture, Mexican American culture. Now, so I grew up in California, right? I have Mexican aunt, Mexican girlfriend from all through my family and community. This is my community, almost more so than being Jewish, which is what I am. But for some of that intricacy, I happen to have a friend, I was telling the story, I was talking about the story a minute earlier, whose name is Luis Orilla, who is I think he's one of our greatest Mexican-American writers. He's a novelist. He was nominated for the Pulitzer nonfiction for Devil's Highway about border. He was born on a dirt road in Tijuana. He's an incandescently brilliant writer. So I'm like, hey, I want to make sure I get all this the cartel theme right. I don't want to go in there reactively against sensitivity readers to not get that as right as I want to get right the tactics, right, or the ordnance or the geography for experts that I'm dealing with. So I gave it to him, right? I found somebody, because my ethic as a storyteller is get everything right. And he's super irreverent and not political and not propagandistic. And, this is better slang. And here's the swear word we'd use instead of this. So that the ethic that I'm tacking towards is the purest version of a story, not how do I make this fit for contemporary political comfort levels so that I don't get taken out in a review. But that boils down to if everything is about maximizing the story, and that also means going in with humility if I'm engaging with different cultures or writing lovingly and complexly about them. I also don't want to make there's a while where everything in fiction, every gay character is like a saint starting an orphanage. And it's come on, write complex characters no matter who you're writing. It's just as flattening to write them one other way. The story and carving out and making that story great. I think of writing a story a lot when you first go to the beach and you lay down a towel on the sand and you lay down, it's always really uncomfortable. And then you have to kind of move around and you move the sand out from under your head. There's a settling in process when you're trying to find a story. And if you can settle in and find that process the right way, and if you're fueled by the foundational orientation in the world towards truth and meaning and beauty, which guess what, guys, we're at Ralston. Those are all fleeting interests, at least of yours. The story necessarily will carry with it, I think, something that will be fortifying or edifying without being too overt. And so my thriller series evolved, the Orphan X series, I'm on book 8. And, he's taken out of a foster home, bless you, at the age of 12 and trained to be an assassin by CIA handler who's also a father figure to him. And he tells him early on when he's 12, the hard part won't be making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And that, because he actually loves this kid who he's charged with. But that piece and that collision for me is basically what the whole series wound up coalescing around. I didn't really plan that. It's in every book. And what the series for me has become about very much, I say my main character's name is Evan Smoke. I say he never learned to speak the strange language of intimacy. He was raised in a foster home. He's trained to be a disposable weapon, right? And if his father figure had made him a true believer, his life would have been easier. There's other true believers who are orphan assassins. But that complexity for me, and then I started to realize the further in that I got and the types of discussions I was having with readers and people who derive different meaning from it, is I'm actually writing this thriller series about the process of becoming human or understanding intimacy or self-awareness from somebody who was raised in a silo to be a perfect expendable killing weapon. So it grew out of the thing that I was trying to arrive at as purely as I could for the sake of story, rather than me saying like, you know, it's I'm going to go listen to 6 Jocko Willem podcasts and then like put all this in to a book that's a sort of constructive version of something. You know, it's the story. If you shine the story through, then I think then people will find meaning in it.
Last question before we conclude and head for drinks and then dinner. Aaron.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. My question kind of ties into Dr. Bryson's question toward the beginning of all of these questions. And he brought up kind of the nature of academic writing, and I really appreciated your response to that question. And so my question, I guess, is about balance, and that is, how do we, when thinking about the importance of the liberal arts education, which certainly is something that I truly believe as a teacher, how do we can maintain that kind of respect for the tradition, for a liberal arts education, for studying philosophy and these texts, but also keep one foot in reality and maintain a sense of authenticity, humility, caring about a spirit about us that allows us to connect with other people from all walks of life, and I guess not locking ourselves up in kind of an esoteric environment. What advice would you have for walking that line?
Don't think that you should educate yourself out of being slightly roguish or renegade, right? So the OSS was the agency that predated the CIA. And they said that their ideal recruit for a spy was a PhD who could win a bar fight, right? And you know, one of the ways I describe Orphan X, which is really interesting, as I was writing this character, one of the things that he's trained separately in a silo, but Jack, who trains him in etiquette and ancient military and the Odyssey, and you know, like if you step on, like, so I did a book tour in Russia, and I always read the etiquette of a country, right? If you step on someone's foot accidentally, you offer your foot for them to tap, so you're even. He needs to know all these things if he's going to go into a foreign country to kill somebody, right? He needs to know where things are. But it's all grounded for him in some ways in the most roguish of all ventures, the second oldest profession, being an assassin. And so everything that he learns in a way is around the purity towards that, but it has practice. It's anchored to the ground also, right? It can't ever just float away and become abstract. And so I describe him as a blue collar Renaissance man. And it's like, high culture is remarkable, right? So-called low culture, right? Like the best food, we've had some spectacular meals here in Savannah, and they varied between this kind of meal and this kind of meal, right? And it's like, part of a liberal arts education, part of that training, part of that ancient Greek training is like, can you highest, swiftest, strongest, which I'm sure I'm getting out of order, Joe, but you know, the Olympic tradition, boxing and wrestling, right? There's a physicality, there's a vivaciousness, right? That's really important. And don't think that for you to be important and to be sort of powerful means to be always a picture of restraint. It helps a lot of times to know where within these fantastic traditions, right, you also need to kick in a few doors, right? And you need to assert things that are worth asserting. And I think in some ways we talk about like the immense, unsophistication or like the horrors of this modern age, right? Of, oh my gosh, can you believe the kind of discourse that we're having on news channels and right? With politicians, it's like, are you kidding me? Like these bars with politicians afraid to cross, people afraid to stake positions. It's like, you won't stake that position you agree with because you're scared of AOC's Twitter following? What are we talking about? And so the things that actually constitute like force and power, we think this is such a scary world right now. It's like, man, the bar for cowardice, it's unbelievably low in this moment, you know? And part of the responsibility that you have in studying the liberal arts is you're learning all these avenues in to carve out from yourself something that's solid, to carve out for yourself that the living statue in the stone. That means you have stilts in the ground, right? Family, physical, spiritual, intellectual, emotional. The training is also for toughness, and toughness is called upon. And what we think constitutes toughness right now in the culture, I mean, one of the conversations I had with Jordan early on, you know, we have a friendship that goes back a lot of years, but he said, and I realized this somewhat later as I caught up to some of this, but he said, like the amount of timidity in the culture and cowardice it's just jaw-dropping. It's jaw-dropping. And so you have a cohort here that doesn't hold that to be the case. But when you go off, don't let your standards, don't become the frog that's boiled a degree at a time until you're cooked, right? And also don't mistake that you want to go have every fight you can have. There's plenty of fights you shouldn't have, right? Most of them on Twitter. It's not about going and bulldozing through everything and feeling like you know it, but like calmly within yourselves, you know, be aware where the limitations are, and don't be afraid to also, you know, continue to have fun and get up to good trouble.
Wow. I'm just going to say, Greg, that you gave us so many wonderful metaphors this evening, and you turned again to the hero's journey and sort of going off to find through difficulty the treasure. I feel you've just taken it and thrown it so generously in front of us. The wisdom of your life, your craft, your love of the arts, your love of life. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.